We start with the urgent question. I call the Shadow Foreign Secretary, David Lammy.
To ask the Deputy Foreign Secretary if he'll make a statement on the war in Gaza.
Deputy Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I thank the Shadow Foreign Secretary for his urgent question. Mr. Speaker, we want to see an end to the fighting as soon as possible. Well over 6 months since Hamas's terror attack against Israel, it is appalling that the hostages are still being held. Very many civilians are also dying in Gaza, and this weekend Hamas rockets killed 4 IDF soldiers and injured others. As we have said, the fastest way to end the conflict is to secure a deal which gets the hostages out and allows for a pause in the fighting in Gaza. We must then turn that pause into a sustainable, permanent ceasefire. Regarding the situation in Rafah, Mr. Speaker, our position has been consistent. We are deeply concerned about the prospect of a military incursion, given the number of civilians that are sheltering there and the importance of that entry point for aid. Entry points for humanitarian aid, including Karim Shalom, must be reopened quickly to allow aid in. Israel must facilitate immediate, uninterrupted humanitarian access in the south, especially the entry of fuel, and ensure protection of civilians and safe passage for those who wish to leave Rafah. As yet, we have not seen a credible plan to protect civilians. We are, of course, following closely the latest developments around the hostage talks. At this stage, while events are still shifting, I cannot provide the House, as the House will understand, with a detailed running commentary. As the British government has said, we want to see a deal agreed that would ensure the release of hostages and a pause in the fighting. A generous offer was on the table last week, proposed by Egypt, accepted by Israel. We need to see Hamas accept a viable deal, and we can start building the momentum towards a permanent, sustained ceasefire. In parallel, we continue to push as hard as we can to get much-needed aid into Gaza via vital land routes alongside sea and air to alleviate the suffering. Israel has now committed to significant steps to increase the amount of aid getting into Gaza. We now need to see this turned into action to ensure aid actually gets over the border and that it is safely and properly distributed. We look to Israel to meet its commitments to flood Gaza with aid. Ultimately, Mr. Speaker, we need a long-term solution to this crisis. This means the release of all hostages, seeing Hamas's rule dismantled, their ability to attack Israel removed, a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, and fifthly, a political horizon to a two-state solution. Israelis and Palestinians should be able to live side by side together in peace and security. This is our goal. We will continue working tirelessly to achieve it, Mr. Speaker.
David Lammy.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, for granting this urgent question. I have to say it is extraordinary that the government did not bring forward a statement today. This is a profoundly concerning moment in this awful war. Ceasefire negotiations appear to be going backwards. Today, the war is not just continuing, it's escalating. Labour has been clear for months that we oppose an offensive in Rafah which risks catastrophic consequences. The US has said that it would be a disaster. The EU has said the world must prevent it. And the UN Security Council has called for an immediate ceasefire. Benjamin Netanyahu is ignoring the warnings of Israel's allies and partners, the UK included. So can the Minister tell me, what will the consequences be? Because we are already seeing the consequences for civilians. Airstrikes in densely packed areas. The Rafah crossing, as well as Karim Shalom, shamelessly attacked by Hamas, now closed. aid reportedly being blocked, northern Gaza in full-blown famine. 1.4 million people are sheltering in Rafah, many ordered there by the IDF in the first place. Yep. Half the children in Gaza are in Rafah. Yep. Where can they go, I ask the Deputy Foreign Secretary, to be safe? The French government said yesterday the forced displacement of any civilian population is a war crime. Does the Minister agree? Mr. Speaker, Hamas is a terrorist organisation. Its cowardly tactics are reprehensible. But that does not change Israel's obligation to follow the rules of war or the government's obligations on arms exports. So can the Minister say why he thinks an attack on Rafah does not present a clear risk of a serious breach of international humanitarian law? And can he confirm whether he has received any assessment, not legal advice, but any assessment or policy advice from FCDO officials that the threshold has already been met? Now more than ever, we need an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages and unimpeded aid to Gaza.
EFS.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Shadow Foreign Secretary sets out in eloquent terms what is effectively the policy of the government and the entire House, and he chides the government for not offering a statement today. I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that the government has not been slow in coming forward in the House in frequent statements and urgent questions, and will continue, and will, of course, Mr. Speaker, continue to do so. He asks about the government's discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu. The Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, the entire government has been very clear on our advice to Prime Minister Netanyahu, and I have set it out repeatedly in the House. And when I last answered questions here from him, I made it very clear what our position is on Rafah as well. He asks about the consequences, Mr. Speaker, and how we deal with those consequences. Britain, together with our allies, through the United Nations, where I remind him on Security Council Resolution 2020 and 2028, Britain was pivotal in securing those resolutions. We are working together to try and improve what is a terrible situation. And, Mr. Speaker, we will continue to do just that, I hope, with the support of the whole House.
Chair of the Select Committee, Alicia Kearns.
Speaker, can I welcome the efforts by the Foreign Secretary, the Deputy Foreign Secretary and the Minister for the Middle East and North Africa, who have been in and out of the Middle East over the last 2 weeks, a lot of time in order to hear from our allies. But as we see the launch of the Rafah offensive, what reassurances have been received that aid access will be protected, but most of all the protection of aid workers? We cannot see the entire aid industry flee from Rafah Junction as is currently being predicted. Al-Mawasi is also being speculated as a safe zone for civilians, but there is no infrastructure. It is what is essentially a desert, and it wasn't safe last time, as we saw when the British charity Medley for Palestinians was bombed, which we still have had no answer. Finally, have we had any proof of life for those Israeli citizens who have now been held for 7 months, many of whom for which there has been no proof of life since at least day 20? What are we doing to push for that proof of life which families so desperately need?
Well, my honourable friend who chairs the Foreign Affairs Select Committee is absolutely right on her last point. We seek proof of life. The families to whom she refers are desperate for information, but that information has not been forthcoming. In terms, Mr. Speaker, of what she said about Rafah, we are deeply concerned about the humanitarian position in Rafah. There would have to be a plan which respected international humanitarian law, and we have yet to see such a plan. And the immediate priorities I set out in my opening remarks must be a humanitarian pause in the fighting, and as the House well knows, such a pause would allow us to get the hostages out potentially, but also to get aid into Gaza.
SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A week ago, from that dispatch box, the Minister said, given the numbers of civilians sheltering in Rafah, it is not easy to see how such an offensive could be compliant within international humanitarian law. Yep. But despite repeated appeals for Israel not to attack Rafah, just hours after they dashed the hopes of a ceasefire, that offensive is happening. So, Minister, is this the breach of international humanitarian law you referred to last week? And will that breach immediately end UK sales of arms to Israel? Or is this yet another example of the UK declaring a red line, only for Israel to completely ignore it without condemnation or consequence? Because, Minister, we know how this plays out. You plead with them, they ignore you, they do what they want, and you find excuses for them. And so a blind eye will be turned to the slaughter of tens of thousands of innocent civilians. And while the UK government calls for more aid to the survivors, it will continue to issue arms export licences. This has been the pattern of behaviour for 7 months. Can we expect anything different now?
Well, he will know, Mr. Speaker, on his final point, that we are working flat out in these very difficult circumstances to achieve something different, and we will continue to do so. He quoted what I said the last time I was at this dispatch box in answer to him, and I would point out that the words that I have used today answering the same question are virtually exactly the same. I made it clear that there would have to be a plan which respected international humanitarian law, and we have not yet seen such a plan, which is entirely consistent with what I said before. He asked me about the issue of the sale of arms. The Foreign Secretary announced on the 9th of April that the British position with regard to export licences is unchanged. We do not publish the government's legal advice, but we always act in accordance with it. And I would point out to him that we publish transparently and on a quarterly basis data on export licensing decisions.
Suella.
Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, I met with survivors of the Nova Festival massacre. I met with people who had fought single-handedly for hours in Israel on October the 7th against brutal Hamas terrorists. Mr. Speaker, we all want peace. We all want to see the end of civilian fatalities, but sometimes countries must fight for peace. Israel has a right to defend herself and a duty to protect her people from the brutal terrorist cult of Hamas. Minister, will you confirm that the UK government will maintain steadfast and resolute support for Israel as she finishes the job to eliminate Hamas from Gaza?
Deputy Foreign Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to hear that my right honourable friend had the chance to meet those whom she met yesterday and to share with them and with the House the hideous circumstances which they have suffered. She makes clear in what she says that Israel has the right of self-defence, and she set out very eloquently why that is the case, but Israel must also abide by international humanitarian law.
John McDonnell.
Can I just say to the Minister, using this expression, if I may, Mr. Speaker, you're better than this? We've all condemned Hamas's attack. We all want to see the hostages released. But we're on the edge of witnessing a massacre, a mass murder of innocent men, women and children at the behest of fanatical zealots in the Israeli cabinet. We need now this government to lead an international exercise to prevent this attack. But one way of preventing it is to make it clear to Netanyahu, if this goes ahead, this government will pursue him as a war criminal into the international courts.
Mr. Speaker, the right honourable gentleman knows very well that the government is working with its allies, working with the powers in the region, working through the United Nations precisely to ensure that that doesn't happen. And he also knows that the Foreign Secretary, the Prime Minister, other government ministers who are in close contact with the Israeli government have made absolutely clear what the effects of a military campaign now conducted within the small confines of Rafah, where so many people are kettled up, what the effects of that would be. And I have made very clear from this dispatch box the view of the government in that respect.
Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. A couple of days ago was Holocaust Memorial Day, and an Israeli commander reminded his men that on that day, 80 years ago, the Nazis led Jews to the ovens for the sole crime of being Jewish. On the 7th of October, Hamas and their supporters at dawn on a public holiday invaded Israel and murdered 1,200 more Jewish people, including children, and raped, dismembered and tortured people. And yes, they put one baby alive in an oven to murder it. They took dozens of hostages and still have many in savage confinement of a medieval nature. Now, many voices put pressure on Israel to do what they believe Israel should do. Does the right honourable gentleman agree with me that some more pressure needs to be put on Hamas to do what they should do, what any civilised human being would call for the release of hostages, and to stop attacking aid points, one of which was attacked at the weekend, killing 4 Israeli soldiers, which, by the way, was an aid point British aid comes through. There's silence about that, and every focus on Israel with none on Hamas.
Deputy Foreign Secretary.
Well, my right honourable and learned friend makes an important point, and I want to emphasise to him, but also to the House, that the hostages are not an afterthought, and they are at the very centre of this. More than 130, including women and children and a Holocaust survivor. And so the balance that the government is trying to strike, the urgent requirement for a pause in all the fighting to enable aid to get in and to negotiate the hostages out, which might then lead as a process to a sustainable ceasefire, is what we are trying to achieve.
Dame Margaret Hodge.
I think we all want an immediate ceasefire. And as we see the start of the destruction of Rafah and the impact that that will have on the civilian population, we're horrified. But I want to ask him a practical question that might get us a step further. How optimistic is he that a sufficient number of hostages will be released to ensure that agreement between the two sides can also be reached, and that Israel then accepts an immediate ceasefire?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the right honourable lady who speaks with authority and understanding on these matters will know that the questions which she asked me is at the heart of the negotiations, which are still continuing and which we very much hope will be successful. I cannot give the House, as I have said before, a running commentary on those negotiations, but I can assure her that the logic which she has just brought to this debate is one that does inform the government's support for getting a resolution to those negotiations.
Kit Malthouse.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last few months, members from across all sides of the House have questioned the Deputy Foreign Secretary about the notion of consequences, and we've heard it again today. And he is an experienced minister, and so he knows that every equivocation, every hesitation, every set of diplomatic niceties has led us to this calamitous moment for the hostages, for the Palestinian people, and for the interests of both peoples in the long term. Now, on the 7th of April, the Foreign Secretary said that support for Israel was not unconditional. So can I ask the question in a different way? Is there any red line? Is there anything the Israeli government could do that would so appall the government that it would feel the need to act? And if so, what is it?
Well, he talks, Mr. Speaker, about the calamitous, this calamitous situation we have reached. And no one in this House will forget that this calamitous situation has started on October the 7th with the brutal events which have just been described by my right honourable friend. And he asked me a rhetorical question, but I tell him this, that the evidence will show that the government has done everything it possibly can to try and alleviate this situation, sometimes unpopularly, but that the government's logic was accepted at the United Nations in the 2 Security Council resolutions which I mentioned just now.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Israeli opposition leader Yair Lapid said at the weekend a government that wants to return the abductees would be sending the teams to Cairo, not crushing the hearts of the families. While Lapid is right, it's not only the hearts of the families of the hostages who are being crushed, but also those of the Palestinians who want to have nothing to do with Hamas terrorists. Many of them are being chased around the Gaza Strip. While the UK rightly defends Israel from the threat of attack by Iran, will the British government also suspend arms exports to Israel?
Yep. No. Well, on his first point, I should say that he will have seen that both sides have sent teams to Cairo, and we await developments on that, and we must do so with a degree of hope and optimism. And on his second point, I've made clear to the House where the government stands on the issue of arms exports. We follow the legal advice. We do not publish it in accordance with precedent, and we will continue to do so.
Mark Logan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my colleagues on this side of the House said that we should be making sure that Rafah comes to an end. But let me say something. What needs to come to an end is the fighting. UNICEF today has said that Rafah is a city of children, and we shouldn't be dancing around and playing words like a game of Scrabble. We should call it what it is, and we should be calling for an immediate ceasefire straight away. Families of hostages want the fighting to end now. My constituents in Bolton demand the fighting to end now. The international community are demanding an immediate stop. Well, one of the most influential countries in the conflict, our own country, the United Kingdom, call for an immediate ending to the fighting.
Well, as my honourable friend knows, and I'm grateful to him for keeping in touch on issues which are brought to his attention by his constituents in Bolton. As he knows, it is exactly the government's policy to try and achieve that pause, which can then lead to a sustainable ceasefire, and we will continue to do everything we can to achieve that.
Julie Elliott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What is the government's plan now to get aid into Gaza now that both Rafah and Kerem Shalom are not accessible? And even if they were accessible, with an invasion now started, there would be no way that you could distribute aid. So what is the government's plan to get aid in to alleviate the appalling suffering of the Palestinian people?
She is right, Mr. Speaker, to identify the fact that yesterday Rafah and indeed Kerem Shalom were shut. No aid was able to get in. That is a matter of immense concern to the government. And she will know that as well as trying to get aid in ourselves through road transport, we have also been a leading nation in trying to assist with the maritime route and also with airdrops, some 11 of which have been made, 10 of which were made by the Royal Air Force.
Therese Coffey, Dr. Therese Coffey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Constituents are understandably devastated by what is happening in Gaza right now, and it is desperate on both sides. I'm conscious of what he's just said about aid being distributed. I wonder if he could make sure that all the resources possible are there to make sure that we carry on with maritime and airdrops of aid. Would he agree with me? Ultimately, this is in Hamas's hands to return the hostages, and that would remove any excuse of Israel's further actions happening in Gaza.
Well, we will certainly continue to boost the maritime efforts. As she knows, those are ongoing, using both British military assets and also using our stores in the region and in particular in Cyprus, as well as technology for clearing kit that is available in Cyprus. We will continue to do everything we can, as we have been, in extraordinarily difficult circumstances to achieve greater entry of aid into Gaza.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The real concern, I think, now is that Netanyahu has one objective, and that's to raise Gaza to the ground. That's what he's intent on doing, and that will include Rafah. The government's told the Israelis that they must not go into Rafah, so has all other Western governments. But if they do, I ask him once again, what are the consequences? Is it a slap on the wrist and don't do it again? Or are there now serious consideration to banning the sale of arms and taking sanctions against individuals and collectively the Israeli government? What is the government going to do? Is it going to do anything at all?
Well, I've made very clear, Mr. Speaker, what the government is seeking to do. He quotes what Prime Minister Netanyahu is saying, but there are many different voices in Israel, as we have seen over this weekend. including significant demonstrations in support of the policy of getting the hostages back, and Britain is doing everything it can to help achieve that.
James Sunderland.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. For me, the defining feature of this appalling tragedy in Gaza is the civilian population inside Gaza that's somehow trapped between the oppression of an appalling terrorist organisation and also an appalling military onslaught. Given the increasing compression of that population within Rafah in a much, much smaller geographical area, the need for precision, for restraint and proportionality from the Israelis is ever more acute. Can the Minister please assure the House that he's doing everything possible to convince the Israelis of the need to preserve the sanctity of human life?
He will know that the government has underlined repeatedly the importance of Israel abiding by international humanitarian law, and the Foreign Secretary and the Prime Minister in frequent contact have underlined the point that he made.
Imran Hussain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite the blatant disregard that we have seen for international law over the last few weeks, the international community has warned that the Israeli ground offensive in Rafah would be a red line. Even the Deputy Foreign Secretary told this House last week that he couldn't see how a military offensive in Rafah would be compliant with international law. So with Israeli troops now ready to move into what is the world's largest and most densely populated refugee camp, where 1.4 million people sit starving, fearful for the lives of their children, I have to ask the Minister, just why did he not come to this House today to announce a strong UK response that immediately supports the ICC's war crimes investigation and immediately ends arms sales to Israel? Frankly, Mr. Speaker, it is shameful that the government come here again today with nothing. So I asked the Minister, please tell this House the question we have all come to answer to, which is, what is the UK government doing to stop this bloodshed and massacre in Gaza about to happen in hours from now?
Well, on his first point, there is no difference between what I have said today and the response which I gave, which he referred to on the last occasion I was at the dispatch box. And he sets out in eloquent tones the nature of the problem that we are facing. But he must recognise that Britain, along with other countries, a large number of regional powers, the international community and at the UN, is trying to stop the very position which he has set out.
Definitely. Andrew Percy.
7 months ago today, many of us began receiving the most alarming messages from friends and or family in Israel. And by the end of that day, every red line of international law had been breached by the monstrous Palestinian terrorists who raped countless women, murdered 1,200 people and took hundreds of innocent people hostage. Within hours, people in this country and some pro-Palestinian activists were on the streets cheering what happened that day. And since then, we've seen the dehumanisation of Jews through the dehumanisation of Israel. The protocols of the Elders of Zion have been dusted off and every anti-Semitic trope has been trotted out. Some people in here, who we would have expected to be allies when it comes to gender-based violence, have had little or nothing to say about the horrors on that day. And now we hear calls for Israel to be denied the right to defend itself, whilst arms will continue to flow to Hamas by Iran and by North Korea. There is nothing kind or compassionate about that message. So will the Deputy Foreign Secretary confirm to me that any ceasefire, which of course we all want, because we all want this tragedy to end, will include the removal and complete removal of Hamas from governance in Gaza?
He is right, Mr. Speaker, what he says, and the rightful aim of defeating Hamas will not be achieved by allowing a humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, as I'm sure he would agree. He mentions gender-based violence, and he will recognise that the government has particularly supplied funding to try and tackle the aspects of that where we're able to make a contribution and some impact. And what he says about the nature of some of what has been said in this House and outside, the government makes very clear that we are absolutely opposed to anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in all its forms.
Beth Winter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last October, the Israeli Defence Minister disgracefully described the Palestinian people as animals. And that is exactly how they've been treated, forcibly displacing men, women and children from the north to the south of Gaza, and now forcibly displacing people again, slaughtering tens of thousands of innocent civilians, creating famine conditions, and now at the risk of a massacre. What we are witnessing this week is a clear escalation of Israel's total disregard for civilian life and international law. We need an immediate ceasefire, but will the Minister finally agree to impose stringent sanctions on Israel, not simply on individual settlers, by ending support for its military capability in Gaza, suspending arms export licences and offering support for ICJ and ICC processes, investing Israel's criminal actions? Where is our humanity?
Can I just say I'm very bothered. Motion's running high. I want to get everybody in, but we won't achieve it at this rate. So please, can we help each other? Deputy Foreign Secretary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, she sets out in lurid terms the issues which we are facing and the problems which the entire international community are trying to address. And she shakes her head, Mr. Speaker, but the fact is that the government is doing everything it can. We've said it out, the Foreign Secretary has said it out, the Prime Minister has said it out, I've said it out from this dispatch box, to try and effect the change which she and I so desperately wish to see.
Manchester.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the Minister's statement with regards to the United Kingdom supporting the people of Gaza with humanitarian aid. The Minister knows I've written to the Foreign Secretary for the United Kingdom to host an international donors conference for Palestine, like it did with International Friends of Syria Group, the largest convening humanitarian donors conference held in the United Kingdom. I understand he thought it was a good idea. Where are we, the United Kingdom, in leading the way in setting up that international donors conference for Palestine?
He is right to identify a political horizon that is constructive. When this ghastly fighting is over, Mr. Speaker, we hope that people will lift their eyes to a political horizon. Britain is doing a lot of work in trying to support that opportunity when it comes, and it may well be at that point that there's a role for Britain in the international community to convene something of that sort.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The invasion of Rafah by the Israeli army comes alongside further discoveries of over 390 bodies in mass graves at Al-Shifa and Nasser hospitals, confirming from the UN evidence of torture, summary executions and instances of people being buried alive, others being buried with their intravenous needles still in their arms. At the most recent Foreign Office questions, the Deputy Foreign Secretary stated that it would be hard to see how an invasion of Rafah would not be, I repeat, not be, in breach of international humanitarian law. So given what I've just outlined, does the UK Government finally consider the invasion of Rafah to be a breach of international humanitarian law? Yes or no?
Alas, Mr. Speaker, such questions are not susceptible to yes or no answers. We have made absolutely clear our view about an invasion of Rafah. And on the specific incidents which he mentions, the full reality of those incidents is not clear, and we need to recognise that what is required, as the British government has made clear, is full and transparent investigations of these matters.
Elias.
Hamas apparently have said to mediators that they do not have 33 living hostages that come into the categories of women, children, elderly and sick. This is an appalling body blow for the relatives of those held captive in Gaza for over 200 days. And will the Deputy Foreign Secretary take the opportunity to acknowledge Israel's right to take military action to get these people home?
Well, she is, my right honourable friend is absolutely right to focus, as she has repeatedly in this House, on the awful plight of the hostages. And she is also right to make clear that under international law, Israel has the right of self-defence to take proportionate action to recover them.
Steve McCabe.
Like many others, Mr Speaker, I pray that pressure from this House and elsewhere can bring this to an end. We all know that will mean agreement on an Arab-led body to maintain peace, order and security. How close are we to that agreement?
The honourable gentleman is absolutely right to try and lift people's eyes to the political horizon so that from this intolerable misery can come hope for the future. There is a great deal of work that is going on in trying to pinpoint and augment the sinews of such a political future. The Foreign Secretary has been repeatedly in the region and especially on the West Bank and in Ramallah, and we will continue to do everything we can to plan for that, along with also trying to resolve the desperate situation in Rafah, where I have tried to set out for the House what Britain is doing.
Mr Speaker, the Deputy Foreign Secretary reminds us we're now in our 7th month here. Talks are not making progress. Hostages still haven't been released, and now border crossings are indeed closing. We are entering another dark chapter in this terrible conflict. And now the UN World Food Programme warns of full-blown famine unless more aid can be delivered. This House is asking what we can actually do. So can I ask the Deputy Foreign Secretary to update the House on the building of that new maritime port off Gaza? This is something that the international community can control, that we can have full stakeholder ownership of. And once it's operational, will British troops be involved in aid delivery?
Well, in respect of his final point, we will have to see what is required. But I can tell him that in terms of trying to secure the temporary pier off the coast of Gaza, that is a way of trying to get additional aid in swiftly. He will know that the Royal Fleet Auxiliary Cardigan Bay is in the area and is effectively the command post for this maritime effort. And Britain, just as we are doing from the air and from land, is also thoroughly and involved and in detail in the maritime effort as well.
Abdul Khan.
Mr Speaker, the UK government has long warned Israel that an invasion of Rafah must not happen. Civilian lives must be protected and aid must enter Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu has shown once again that he is not listening to his allies or the ICJ and is hell-bent on turning the whole of Gaza into a graveyard. Will the UK government now urgently impose a full arms embargo on Israel in the hope that it is the only thing that UK can do to try and stop the starvation and the potential genocide of those left in Rafah?
In the early part of his question, he did indeed set out what we are all of us trying to address. When it comes to an arms embargo, he will know that the amount of arms that Britain supplies is negligible, but equally we operate an arms supply regime, an arms sales regime, which is strictly governed by the rules which I've set out to the House before, and we continue to act in respect of the question that he asked me, in respect of the legal advice that we receive, and we will continue to do so.
Tom Hunt.
Speaker, of course I'm greatly concerned about the humanitarian situation in Gaza right now, but I'm also greatly concerned that anything happens that gives Hamas an increased foothold in Gaza, which puts them in a position where it can inflict more evil and more misery, like we saw on October 7th. I'm also concerned that some of these ceasefire agreements seem to involve releasing hundreds of terrorists, Hamas terrorists, and don't involve all of the hostages being fully released. Will the Deputy Foreign Secretary give me a commitment that we intensify plans for a Hamas-free Gaza so that people, innocent people in Gaza, can look forward with hope to a future and peace?
He is absolutely right, Mr. Speaker, that Hamas can have no role in Gaza in the future, and much of the work that we are doing in that respect is designed to help build up the Palestinian Authority so that it can be involved in governing both the West Bank and Gaza as soon as the time is right.
George Galloway.
It's precisely the point, Mr. Speaker, that the Deputy Foreign Secretary's answers today are virtually identical to the one he gave, including to me, last Tuesday. The situation has escalated, but the government's response remains the same. There are 600,000 child hostages in Rafah alone. There's no proof of life from them, but millions of our people are watching on their phone today the proof of death and mutilation of many of them. The government say they're doing everything they can, but they are not, because you could now stop sending weapons to the people who are raining down this death and misery. And the Labour Party could actually ask you to, but didn't.
When you say you, it's not me that's responsible. The Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about the fact that the answers I gave to him, indeed, and to others last Tuesday are the same. And they reflect, insofar as the parameters of the situation are the same, the fact that the policies we are pursuing are long-term and they are designed to tackle the evils that have been so clearly set out this afternoon in the House. He also makes a point about the number of children who are denied food and medicine in Rafah, and he will know that Britain has, through medical aid and through the British contribution, not least through a field hospital, been careful to make sure that where we can bring help, medical help, particularly to children, we are doing so.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's now 214 days since those 130-plus hostages have been held in barbaric conditions, been subject of rape and torture, and indeed denied medical access from the International Red Cross. The sad reality is that Israel put on the table a deal that could have led to a ceasefire right now in return for some of those hostages, but not all, and indeed for the release of Palestinian prisoners who've been convicted in courts of law. Secretary Blinken has described this as an extraordinary, generous offer, yet Hamas refused to accept it. Does my right honourable friend take the view that Hamas have it in their power to accept the position of a ceasefire and the violence and war can come to an end naturally as a result?
The point that my honourable friend makes, one that in different ways has been echoed across the House, is that we must ensure we do everything we can to make certain that these negotiations that are taking place at the moment in Cairo make progress and are successful. And that tonight is what everyone should be hoping can be achieved.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just to repeat what I think that the Deputy Foreign Secretary has been saying to us today, and that is we have not seen a credible plan for evacuation from Rafah. That is what he has said, and there is currently an incursion into Rafah. Now, if I add those two things up, what he is saying between the lines is that Israel has currently breached the rule that the UK has set. And I don't think he wants to say it here, but that is what I am hearing. So if there is no credible plan to move those people and the attack is ongoing, when can we expect, if not today, an update on the UK's position towards Israel, arms sale and other things that have been mentioned today from this dispatch box?
Well, I have given her the update from the dispatch box insofar as there is an update to give. And she asked me about the words that we are using in respect of Rafah. What I have made clear is that we have not seen a credible plan for military action in Rafah so far, and therefore we are not able to judge whether or not it would be in accordance with international humanitarian law. And that is the point which I have been making to the House.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Israel is our friend and ally, but that doesn't stop us questioning their actions. My right honourable friend today, the Deputy Foreign Secretary, says he wants to see much more aid getting into Gaza. The actions in Gaza over the weekend have only made those miles-long queues of lorries even greater.
Yeah.
Air and sea drops are difficult. Will he today, on behalf of the government, appeal to our allies to allow those mile-long queues in Rafah to rapidly go into Gaza and relieve the suffering of the people there?
Yeah.
Well, we continually appeal, Mr. Speaker, for more aid to get in by road. We have made the arrangements through the maritime form of entry and from the air, but getting aid in through the road system and through the entry points is by miles the best way to achieve that. And I said at the outset of my remarks that we were very concerned indeed that no aid got in through Rafah or Karim Shalom yesterday. We are doing everything we can, as we have been since the start of this crisis, to ensure that more aid is getting in, and we will continue to do so.
Samuel Wilson.
Speaker, the pro-Hamas network of the press, politicians and protesters are becoming increasingly hysterical in their efforts to stop Israel pursuing those who carried out the pogrom of murder, rape, torture and hostage-taking last October. Does the Minister accept that if there is to be long-term peace in the Middle East, we must continue to support Israel in its battle against Hamas, in defending itself and in pursuing those who are cynically hiding behind innocent civilians today and then tomorrow use those deaths, the deaths of those innocent civilians, as a propaganda weapon?
Well, he makes the point, Mr. Speaker, that Israel does have the right of self-defence, but I'm sure he would accept that that must be exercised within international humanitarian law.
Don Butler.
Speaker, Minister, what does finish the job mean? With 40,000 people dead, many of them children, is it when every single man, woman, child, baby is dead in Gaza? Is that what finish the job means? The government said that an invasion of Rafah wouldn't be compliant with international law. The Minister says that we don't supply that much arms to Israel. Well, if we were to stop the supply that we do supply, wouldn't that send a message that our government abides by and thinks it's important that we follow international law?
Well, the Honourable Lady, I hope, will accept that the government, while it doesn't publish the legal advice that it receives, it always acts in accordance with it.
Yes. Ms. Savile Roberts.
My constituent Emily Fairs has family in Gaza. Here's her message. We heard from our family yesterday. Half of them have now fled Rafah after threatening evacuation orders fell from the sky. When we spoke to them, they didn't know where they were going. They mentioned Al-Mawasi. But there is no building there for them to stay. It's not safe there. There are no food provisions there. There's nowhere to go to the toilet, nowhere to wash. They are now utterly destitute. Forced displacement is a war crime, Mr. Speaker. His government have it in their power to set up a scheme for people desperate to join family in the UK. If not now, when?
Well, the Honourable Lady sets out the reports that she has received, which are heartrending reports, and that is why the government, with as much vigour and cooperation with our allies, is trying to do those things which I have set out.
Lawrence Eshel-Lermy.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the initial Israeli offence in Rafah began last night and it's been described as limited. An operation is not limited if it results in the evacuation and forced displacement of around 100,000 people. An operation is not limited if it results in all crossing being closed and humanitarian aid being completely halted. We cannot, as a House, downplay the significance of what is happening. The Minister said that the government is doing everything they can. But will the Minister make clear from that dispatch box that the government does not support this offensive and that there must be consequences under international law if it goes ahead?
Mr. Speaker, the government's made it absolutely clear that we have yet to see a plan in respect to any military operations in Rafah, but we have always made it clear that any such plans must abide by international humanitarian law.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For months, the Minister has come here and told us the government's asking the Israeli government to do this, the government's requesting that the Israeli government does that. The harsh truth is that Israel is ignoring the UK government. And the truth is that our government actually now needs to act. Words are not enough. We need action to show that there are consequences for breaching international law. Act now by ending arms sales. Act now by suspending the trade talks, because if the government doesn't do what's necessary and take the action to help prevent the attack on Rafah, then isn't it the case that the Israeli government will see it as our government giving them the green light to commit yet more war crimes?
The honourable gentleman will have seen what the Foreign Secretary has said, what the Prime Minister has said, and he will have seen the way in which we are working with our allies, with countries in the region, to try and improve the situation. And he will know, as the whole House knows, that there is no magic solution to this. We have to continue to persist with the arguments and with the logic that is so clearly set out in United Nations Security Council resolutions 2020 and 2028, and we will continue to do so.
Mr.
Speaker, over the last 7 months, I and many of us across this House have come to the Chamber to gain an understanding of what the red lines are for the UK government, but it feels like there aren't many. It felt like it wasn't a red line when babies in Gaza were removed from the wombs of their dead mothers. It felt like it wasn't a red line when children in Gaza looked up to the sky, not knowing if aid or bombs were going to drop on them. And now in Rafah, displaced refugees once again face the threat of forcible transfer. And again, it doesn't feel like this is a red line. Yet given that there's precedent for halting arms sales to Israel, will the UK government finally halt arms sales? And if not, can the Deputy Foreign Secretary please explain to us what is the cost associated to a Palestinian life, and what are the red lines? What does Benjamin Netanyahu have to do that is too much?
Well, the case that she makes, Mr. Speaker, is one that should encourage everyone, the government, but everyone else as well, to do everything they can to bring an end to this catastrophic conflict, which is causing such pain to so many.
Thank you, Mr.
Speaker. I will start again as I always do. I condemn Hamas. I think all the refugees on both sides should be returned. But the attack on Gaza has started. The escalation of humanitarian disaster, catastrophe continues in contradiction to international law. Too much hand-wringing has taken place. Too much making excuses has taken place. We have to call what it is. We stand whilst people are starving, while children are dying of malnutrition, while there is no support for the civilians in that area. As the case has been for hostages to be released, what will happen when that Rafah is bombed? What will happen to the Israeli refugees? This is a policy which is doomed from start. Will he call for a ceasefire now and move forward?
Well, he will know that the government has consistently sought a pause so that the hostages can get out and aid can get in, and has worked tirelessly, I would argue, to try and ensure that aid does get in, including inventing new ways of trying to achieve that. And he started his question by pointing out that an attack had started in Rafah, but he will also know that negotiations are proceeding in Cairo, and we must hope that those negotiations are successful as quickly as possible.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask again, with nowhere safe for Palestinians to go and overcrowding in places like Al-Mawassa, where exactly does the UK government think Palestinians displaced from eastern Rafah should go next? And if he has no answer, why does the government's response just remain the same?
As I have repeatedly made clear, Mr. Speaker, we think there needs to be a pause in the fighting, which, in the way that I have expressed on numerous occasions in the House, can lead to a sustainable ceasefire.
Kenny McCaskill.
It's not time to recognise that Israel's actions are not a disproportionate response to 7th of October. They are in fact part of a concerted plan to make Gaza unlivable, to extirpate the Palestinian population there, at the same time as they encroach upon Palestinian territories in the occupied West Bank. And as a result of that, is it not time that we ceased arms sales, stopped being complicit in their military actions, reinstated UNRWA aid, and conjoined with other nations in condemning this dreadful genocide?
Well, as I've said to the House before, Mr. Speaker, I do not think it is helpful to use terms like genocide, and I think it's important that the House should recognise that the findings of the court have been misrepresented in that respect. As Joan Dongu, a former president of the ICJ, still serving at the time of the preliminary decision, stated, the ICJ did not decide that the claim of genocide was plausible.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister talks about a pause. The United Nations voted for a resolution calling for a ceasefire. The Minister is now talking about looking at military plans by the Israelis in relation to Gaza, when thus far the international community has made clear that there shouldn't be an invasion of Gaza. It feels like the Minister's going backwards, and his government has still failed to restore UNRWA funding, which is making the matter and the misery worse, and he has failed to take action to make sure his government supports the implementation of the International Court of Justice provisional measures and the ICC investigation to the occupied Palestinian territories. The Minister has got a good track record in the past, but he is failing us by taking us backwards on this very important issue. When is he going to take action on these specific measures?
Can we really speed up questions that some people aren't going to get into?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't recognise the early part of her question, but let me assure her, as I have in the past of the House, that we are doing everything we can to address the dreadful situation which she has so eloquently articulated.
Senator Beckham.
The Minister's reply on the 17th of April to my written question referred to wanting to, and I quote, see Israel take greater care to limit its operations to military targets. Can the Minister confirm that he is finally aware, therefore, that Israel has not limited its onslaught to military targets, and given the government's own licensing criteria refers to risk that items might be used to facilitate a serious violation of international humanitarian law or serious acts of violence against women or children, how can continue to arm Israel's bombardment of Palestinian civilians possibly be justified?
She referred, Mr. Speaker, to a number of early incidents which have been condemned, and she will know that in respect of each of those incidents, the government has said that we want an independent and credible investigation and transparent conclusions so that we know why and how these acts took place.
Ian Byrne.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister has said that the policy has not changed, but the facts on the ground have. Ordering the evacuation of 100,000 people is not a small operation. That is a big operation. Now, the Minister knows that the clear test for suspending arms sales is a clear risk of a breach of humanitarian law. But he's told the House this afternoon that he has got no assurances that that breach is impossible because he has not seen a plan. So can he tell the House what advice he has given to the Department for Business and Trade and when about their legal obligations to suspend arms sales now? And can he lay this out for us this afternoon before he comes before the Select Committee on the 21st of May to give evidence?
Well, the position on arms sales is very clear, and on legal advice also, as the Right Honourable Gentleman will be aware. And he knows that we always follow carefully, although we do not publish it, the legal advice, and we always act in accordance with it. And he will also know that in the light of that legal advice, as the Foreign Secretary announced on the 9th of April, the UK position with regard to export licences remains unchanged.
Andrew Weston.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Gaza is bleeding and Gaza is starving. At least 34,700 people are dead, the majority of them women and children, while a man-made famine continues to take hold. How much further do things need to escalate before this government finally takes action, restores UNRWA funding and finally calls for an immediate ceasefire?
He raises the issue of UNRWA, as it was raised indeed by his honourable friend, and I should have responded on that point. Britain currently is in the position of not owing any money to UNRWA, and we have said that we are considering the Kelowna report. We are waiting for the OIOS report. In due course, we will come to the House and tell the House the decision we have made. But it's important to recognise that at the current time, Britain is fully paid up in respect of UNRWA's money and work.
Drew Hendry.
Thank you. More than 14,500 children have been killed in Gaza. Is the Minister proud that the UK continues to sell arms for use in this action?
I am proud, Mr Deputy Speaker, that Britain is doing everything it can. The government is bending every sinew to try and resolve this desperate situation, to try and make sure that we get aid into Gaza, flood Gaza with aid, as the Israeli government has promised, but also that we get the hostages out whose families have suffered so much since the appalling pogrom on October the 7th.
Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Deputy Foreign Secretary has said that he's still waiting to see the military plans from Israel in relation to Rafah. But we're all watching the consequences of the execution of those plans, which is already underway. As part of what we've seen overnight has been the very deliberate destruction of any signage that describes the territory as Gaza and the taking down of Palestinian flags and replacing them with Israeli flags. That's not necessary in any way to neutralise any security threat. Has he asked Israel, what is it doing? Why has it done that? And can he give me one example of a consequence now that this red line has been crossed?
Well, we continue to make it clear to Israel that they should not, in these circumstances, be conducting military operations in Rafah until there is a proper plan which ensures that they stand by their duties and responsibilities under international humanitarian law.
Clark.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Thousands of children killed, hostages not released, Israel accused of war crimes, global outrage at Israel's conduct, and Hamas very much in being. This is how not to fight a war. Even war has rules, Mr Deputy Speaker. So given the number of civilians sheltering in Rafah, can the Minister make clear UK government does not support the Rafah offensive?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I've made crystal clear where the government stands on the issue of any Rafah offensive, and we will continue to do everything we can, as I have clearly, I hope, set out to the House, to bring about an urgent resolution of this extraordinarily difficult and catastrophic situation.
Alicia Carmichael.
Mr Deputy Speaker, in recent months, Israeli forces in Gaza have been responsible for the killing of aid workers, medics, journalists, including British citizens amongst them. They've been responsible for the targeting of civilian infrastructure. In these circumstances, what possible basis can there be in law for continuing to supply weapons to Israel?
Mr Deputy Speaker, the decisions on weapons licences are not made across the floor of the House, nor are they made on the basis of emotion. They are made on the basis of the rules clearly set down. They are governed by the advice that we receive from lawyers, and we act in accordance with that advice.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. 1.4 million displaced people kettled in the south of the Gaza Strip, precisely where they were told to go, now facing mass starvation, a humanitarian catastrophe unfolding before our eyes. The Rafah offensive cannot and it must not be allowed to happen. The Deputy Foreign Secretary says he's yet to see a plan, credible or not. But a plan clearly exists if the Israeli authorities are asking 100,000 people to move. So can I ask the Deputy Foreign Secretary this? Given that he has not been clear to the House on consequences or indeed advice from officials, if there is a breach of international law, at which point is the British government also complicit?
Yeah. Well, the government has made it clear that all countries, and Israel in this conflict, must abide by international humanitarian law. He will be well aware that there are consequences for not abiding by international humanitarian law, and Britain stands by its own international commitments in that respect and expects others to do likewise.
Gavin Newlands.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the Minister said, "We have not seen a credible plan to protect civilians." This has been the case since the shameful atrocities of October the 7th. 7 months on and 35,000 deaths, we get the same lip service, the same drivel about urging Israel to follow international law, all whilst the Labour front bench gave them political cover. The UK shamefully continues to send arms to Israel, so if, as I think it will be, this is found to be a genocide and Netanyahu therefore a war criminal, this government and therefore this country will be complicit, will it not?
Yeah. Well, I think he uses lurid language, and I think, Mr Deputy Speaker, that he should recognise what the government is seeking to do together with our allies, both in the region and internationally, and support the government in that endeavour.
Nadia Whittam.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I want the Deputy Foreign Secretary to imagine that he was in Rafah. If bombs were being dropped on his family and there was no safe place for them to go, I'm sure he would want governments like ours to use every available lever to stop the attack, that he would rightly expect to receive protection. So why is it different for Palestinians? What will it take for this government to call for an immediate ceasefire, stop arms sales to Israel, and hold Netanyahu to account for his war crimes?
She is right, Mr Deputy Speaker, to set out the jeopardy of the family which she describes in Rafah. And that is why, on so many different fronts, the government, along with its allies, is trying to bring about a resolution to these matters. The fact that so far we have not been fully successful in that endeavour should not deter us from continuing to try to do the right thing in these respects.
Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. The Minister raises concerns about misrepresentation. So let us be clear. Those protesting in Israel in support of the hostages were protesting against Netanyahu and his approach in Rafah. Well, that was not the impression that the Minister gave. Those protesters, those hostage families, recognise, as this House does, that military action in Rafah, the man-made famine, the displacement of 100,000 people to a place where they're trying to put tents up in rubble, is not going to lead to the release of hostages. It's not going to lead to a two-state solution. It will probably lead to further war crimes. The UK cannot sit this out. So will the Minister at least be honest? He won't tell us why he won't suspend arms sales. Will he tell us whether our intelligence shows that, to date, British-made weapons and technology have been used in Rafah? Yes or no?
Well, she asks me at the beginning of her question about the demonstrations, the extensive demonstrations that have been seen in Israel. And she is right about that, and that is why I said in my earlier answer that there was a plurality of views in Israel, and many of those views do not coincide with the views of Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Helen Hayes.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. There is nowhere safe for people in Rafah. There is no relief for people in northern Gaza who are starving as aid is being choked off again. The situation in Gaza is intolerable and there are clear breaches of international law. None of this serves the cause of peace or hastens the release of the hostages.
So I ask the Deputy Foreign Secretary, who has been short on detail today, where is the accountability, and specifically what actions is he taking to ensure the implementation of the UN Security Council resolution requiring a ceasefire and the ICJ interim judgment?
Well, I've clarified one aspect of the ICJ interim judgment, which I think I hope is helpful to the House. But in respect of the details which she says are lacking today, I would put it to her and to the House that we have been very open and very clear about what we expect to happen. We have argued and we have used our money and our influence diplomatically to make progress in this matter, and we will continue to do so.
Jim McMahon.
Mr. Speaker, the Deputy Foreign Secretary knows that international law applies to all, or it matters to none. Of course, he speaks of the right of self-defence, and the House would agree with that, but what we've seen is far beyond self-defence. Now, outside of all the noise around that day, on the 21st of February, this House set out its position, and it said in black and white, no ifs, no buts, we do not support the offensive into Rafah. And that is the position of this House as we stand here today. Now, can I ask him, given what he said, and it's quite clear that he doesn't believe that an offensive into Rafah would meet international law, is he in that circumstance content with UK-supplied arms being used in that offensive? And if not, what will he do about it?
Well, I've made it very clear, Mr. Deputy Speaker, where the government stands in respect of arms sales. There is a strong precedent for the way we handle these issues, which certainly was pursued by the party opposite when they were in government, and we will continue to operate in precisely the way I have set out to the House in the future.
Sian
Mr. Speaker, the consequences of Israel's offensive for the Palestinians are absolutely clear. Death, destruction, starvation, disease on a scale even greater than the horrors that we have already witnessed. But I think it beggars belief that the Deputy Foreign Secretary comes to this House and cannot set out any consequences for Israel of that offensive. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we are here because our constituents hold us to account for what is happening in Gaza. Why does he refuse to hold Israel to account for what is happening there?
Well, I do not recognise, Mr. Deputy Speaker, her description on the question of accountability. We have been very clear on accountability in this House to all sides in this appalling conflict, and we will continue to be so.
Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Aid workers returning from Gaza, the first thing they talk about is the smell, because there are rivers of sewage in Gaza at the moment. The assault on Rafah means displacing people from a place with very poor sanitation to a place with no sanitation and catastrophic health outcomes. Only UNRWA can provide the sanitation needs at scale to solve this. The EU, Australia, Canada, Denmark, Finland, Germany, Iceland, Japan and Sweden have all restored funding to UNRWA. The Deputy Foreign Secretary has talked about the zero sum with UNRWA, but it needs to be fully restored and increased to stop this health and sanitation catastrophe. Why won't the government increase funding to UNRWA?
Well, I've made clear, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the process the government is going through in respect of its commitments to UNRWA in the future. But I've also made clear that as far as the current situation is concerned, we have fully funded and met our commitments to UNRWA, and we will make decisions in the future when we have completed our review of the Kelowna inquiry and the OIOS report from the United Nations.
Andy McDonnell.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The earlier comment that Israel should get on and finish the job sent a chill through this chamber and through the homes of millions of people in our country, because they know what that means. It means the increased numbers of children being massacred in Rafah, and I'd like the Deputy Foreign Secretary to distance himself from that comment. But given the evidence in the High Court, which says that the UK government has not received any legal advice on potential violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza since 29th of February, can the Minister say what confidence he has that the £13 million worth of aerial target equipment licensed for sale to Israel at the end of 2022, or the 10 million worth of military support vehicle sales approved in May last year, will not result in the death of civilians in Rafah.
On his first point, Mr. Deputy Speaker, any member of the House who asks a question is responsible for what they say and how they say it, and I, from this dispatch box, gave an answer to all the questions that have been asked, whether he approves of them or not. And on the second point he makes, where he, with great skill, seeks to flash out a different answer, I have nothing to add to what I've already said on the subject of arms sales.
Patrick Grady.
Speaker, at a recent event in Glasgow, I heard the parish priest of Gaza describe the situation as almost like hell on earth. If an individual were to escape that hell in Gaza and make their way to the UK by irregular means, because there is no humanitarian visa, there is no safe and legal route, is it the government's position that such a person should be deported to Rwanda?
Well, he asks me a hypothetical question, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and when he comes up with a specific case where there is a need for a response, I will, of course, give it to him.
Maybe Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Like most people here, I want to see an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages and access to humanitarian aid. But quite frankly, I've been absolutely gobsmacked by the Deputy Foreign Secretary's response. I see no levers that the government is using to influence the Israeli government in their behaviour. And I see this playing of words around what our obligations are under international law about our arms licensing process. As I'm reading it here from the UN, if there is a plausible risk of genocide, we should not be supplying arms to any country. The ICJ has already ruled that there is a plausible risk of genocide. So will the Deputy Foreign Secretary stop dancing on the head of a pin and do something about this?
Well, at the heart of her question, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is the use, throwing across the chamber, the use of the word genocide, which I do not think is helpful. But if she had heard what I had said earlier, I specifically, I hope, was helpful to the House in showing why what she said about the ICJ and genocide was totally inaccurate by quoting the former president of the ICJ.
James Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. We need an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and a massive surge of aid going to all parts of Gaza. As we have warned for months now, an Israeli offensive in Rafah would be catastrophic and it must not go ahead. So what is the UK government doing to make sure there is maximum international pressure to stop this offensive from happening and to urgently secure an agreement that includes an immediate ceasefire?
He makes the point that everyone wants to see a pause in the fighting, a sustainable ceasefire, aid getting in very significant volumes, and the hostages getting out. And that is the policy of the British government. We are doing everything we can, together with our allies, to achieve those aims, and we will continue to do so.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, Israel has a right to defend its people, a right to have the 135 hostages released, a right to destroy the 4 Hamas battalions that are still operating, whose goal is to murder everyone who is Israeli or of Jewish origin. But following the devastating breakdown of ceasefire talks, will the Minister outline how government can continue to work with Israel to see the hostages released and the end to hostilities, bearing in mind that families on both sides of the Gaza conflict are grieving and want an end to bloodshed and want a future for all their children?
Well, as ever, my honourable friend accurately, in his first 3 points, sets out the situation. And in respect of his final point, we will continue to work with everyone to try and achieve a resolution to these issues in the way I've set out today.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Having promised that Rafah would provide safe sanctuary, they now demand that the Palestinians must leave. Having frustrated humanitarian aid, they have now seized and closed the Rafah and Kerem Shalom crossings. Having killed 100 journalists, they have now seized and closed down Al Jazeera in Gaza. On Israel's government, the former US Middle East envoy, Dennis Ross, stated today that, and I quote, "At a certain point, Netanyahu needs to choose Biden over Ben-Gvir and the hostages over Smotrich." Does the government agree with Ambassador Ross that we are at that moment?
Minister.
Well, we listen to everyone who comments on these matters, and we have, throughout these appalling circumstances, been at a number of critical points. But he made the point at the beginning of his remarks that getting aid in through entry points which are currently shut is vitally important. We completely agree with that. It's why we've supported the maritime and the air initiatives, but opening up these entry points remains the most important and most effective way of getting aid and humanitarian relief to desperate people.
Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Everyone in this House knows aid trickling into Gaza has been a stop-start affair, but a critical lifeline to support Palestinian civilians nonetheless. Today, that lifeline has been cut off yet again. So my question to the Minister is, does this represent a failure of this government's policy? Does it amount to a breach of international humanitarian law? And, like everybody else, what will the consequences be?
Well, the government is always in favour of people being held to account for their actions. She will have gathered from what I've said today, but also on other occasions from this dispatch box, that where there is a need for a transparent inquiry, the government always stands up for it. She mentioned the fact that aid has trickled in. She will know that part of the government's intensive efforts have been to try and ensure that aid volume is increased. She will have heard what the Israeli government said about flooding Gaza with aid, and we are doing everything we can to increase the flow and hold the Israeli government to account for what they have committed to do in respect of aid entering Gaza.
Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. We all want to see an immediate ceasefire by all parties and the release of all hostages. The UN reports that cases of acute malnutrition amongst children continue to rise due to shortage of food, deteriorating health, water and sanitation, and of fear and stress undermining the ability of mothers to breastfeed their babies. Aid through Rafah has been very limited, and now that route has been cut off. So can the Minister tell us, does he consider the cutting off of aid routes to the civilian population a breach of the ICJ's interim report?
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, we are trying to ensure that we get aid in a number of different ways. She will have heard me set out what those ways are, and I think we've taken advantage of all the opportunities we can find to increase the amount of aid getting into Gaza, and we will continue to do everything we can to intensify that approach.
Peter Grant.
Mr Deputy Speaker, the remit of the International Criminal Court doesn't only extend to war criminals in the Israeli government and in Hamas. It extends to any government that has failed to take reasonable steps to prevent these atrocities. The Minister may be happy to hide behind the defence of my lawyer said it was okay, but does he respect, first of all, the right of UK civil servants to take their own independent legal advice in these matters, and will he give an assurance that no British civil servant will be put under any pressure to do anything if they honestly believe that it contributes to crimes against humanity or war crimes in Gaza?
Mr Deputy Speaker, the roles and rights of British civil servants in these matters are very clearly codified, and the government respects that absolutely.
I'd like to thank the Deputy Foreign Secretary for coming here today and responding to the urgent question for almost, well, a few minutes short of an hour and a half. Thank you very much. Point of order, Sir Michael Ellis.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and it's on this topic. Sir Robert Choate, the chair of the UK Statistics Authority, published a letter on Friday pointing out the uncertainties and bias as regards the Hamas-run Gaza Ministry of Health casualty statistics. Many academic statisticians have also pointed out, Mr Deputy Speaker, the Hamas figures are metronomically linear and obviously fabricated. Honourable members in this House on all sides have used these terrorist figures, some with careless abandon, but Sir Robert has said, and I quote, "It would be desirable for ministers, shadow ministers and other parliamentarians to state the source of any estimates they use in the public domain and to recognise their limitations." Will you, Mr Deputy Speaker, advise members in this House to heed the urging of the UK Statistics Authority and be highly cautious about using Hamas casualty statistics?
I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for his point of order and giving forward notice of it. As he knows, comments made in this chamber by members is not the responsibility of the Chair, but he has successfully put his own view on the record. Thank you very much. In which